Hey guys, this video is for the sophomores. Today we're going to talk about the reasons why Reconstruction failed. So we've been spending the past bunch of videos, I think in fact all our videos since this remote learning thing started, talking about Reconstruction. Now the thing is that Reconstruction, ended in 1877 with the compromise where the Southerners would agree that Hayes could be elected president, and in return, they would accept Hayes would end Reconstruction. So was that though? No, because the whole Reconstruction experience deserves a lot of discussion. Why it failed, whether it really failed, and a whole bunch of other things. So we're going to talk about that today. Now, I don't know if any of you guys have ever heard the expression "a fool's errand." I don't know if people say it as much these days, but a fool's errand is basically something that you do, but you know is going to fail, or you should have known was going to fail. So you're trying something that really is not going to work, but you do it anyway. It's a fool's errand. When I was in college studying Reconstruction, my professor recommended a book called A Fool's Errand, written by a man named Albion Torgay. Now, the subtitle of A Fool's Errand is A Fool's Errand by One of the Fools. So a little bit about Mr. Torgay. Torgay was a carpetbagger politician who went down south. He fought in the Civil War, and then he stayed down south after the war was over, became a prominent Republican politician in North Carolina, absolutely committed to Reconstruction. And the thing is that he committed to the issue of black rights. Now, what Albion Torgay discusses in this novel, which is actually it's a novel, but it's really an autobiography, a memoir of his experience as a Republican politician, as a carpetbagging Republican politician in the South. He just basically says that there's no way that this is going to work, that this was going to work. We're going to keep trying. We're going to keep fighting for black rights. But based on the conditions in the South, and also the very blasé attitude, or in fact negative attitude in the North toward Reconstruction, that it was never going to work. So we're going to just dissect that a lot more in this video. Also, Torgay, that name is kind of forgotten about today, but in 1909, when the NAACP was founded, the NAACP, is the preeminent black rights group in America. I think it's the oldest black rights group in America as well. When they were founded on Lincoln's birthday in 1909, they said the three great heroes of black America were Frederick Douglass, Abraham Lincoln, and Albion Torgay. So again, a name that's unfortunately forgotten to history in many ways, but a man who was known, a white man known for being absolutely committed to black rights, to his credit, and he used his own experiences as the basis for this novel. And what he talked about was just the fact that there was this unbending Southern opposition to Reconstruction. And it just wouldn't yield. In fact, got worse in many ways as the years went on. This determination, this single-minded obsession with restoring white supremacy, that all the Reconstruction politicians and supporters of Reconstruction had to kind of go up against. This single-minded obsession to restore white supremacy, and also this unbelievable violence that was taking place in the American South, in the beginning perpetrated by the Ku Klux Klan, but then by an assortment of vigilante groups that were determined to restore white supremacy. Let's ask the question now: could Reconstruction have succeeded? Did it have any chance of actually working? In the very beginning, yes. When the radical Republicans basically won control of the American government, passed all those pieces of legislation over Johnson's veto, and if they had been implemented and they faced less Southern opposition and more Northern support, then they could have had a chance of succeeding. But there's a lot of ifs there. right? Neither one of those things was going to happen. Southern opposition was unyielding and got even greater as time went on. They didn't get used to the whole idea of Reconstruction. In fact, their opposition became even deeper. And also, there was this Northern fatigue. A lot of Northerners were just tired of Reconstruction, the Negro question, the Southern question. They had all these code words for it. Some opposed Reconstruction for idealistic reasons, like the liberal Republicans we discussed in the last video. People who just felt that placing civilians under martial law, as the federal government did in the South during the Reconstruction years, was just wrong. So there were some people who opposed it for that reason, but there were other people who opposed it just because they felt this was not worth the effort. Like, why are we going to exert all this effort for black rights? That it's just not worth it. So the supporters of Reconstruction met Southern resistance at almost every turn, and the Southerners, from the Southern point of view, and they were wrong, and I'm not being biased. I'm sure most Southerners even today would say this. The Southerners would not accept the huge social change that was actually taking place in their midst. Their entire social system had been uprooted. Right, they had a plantation slavery system for centuries, and then all of a sudden this was gone. They suffered a brutal civil war, most of the fighting having taken place in the South. Black people who were just slaves like yesterday are now gaining the right to vote and also holding office. Now, for racist Southerners, this was just too much to accept. They couldn't. And then also, and perhaps almost as significant, there was this loathing of Northern interference in their affairs. Remember, that was something that was on the Southern mind forever, right? That predated the Civil War, right? This almost siege mentality in the South that the North was out to get us. And that was certainly reinforced by the 4 years of Civil War, where the South lost almost a generation of young men. And now the Reconstruction experience, where the Northern government, well, I won't say Northern government, the American government was placing the South under martial law. So this hatred, this loathing, this fear of Northern interference in their affairs was another very big factor behind their hatred of Reconstruction. But at the end of the day, the biggest factor was racism, right? The Southerners just could not accept that black people, everyone accepted virtually that slavery was over in the South. But people in the South could not accept black people being equal citizens. They could not accept them holding office. They could not accept them voting. This was just something that most white Southerners just couldn't accept. So with all those things being true, in many ways, Reconstruction was bound to fail unless Northerners completely supported it, and they were willing to put all their energy behind it. Now, in the very beginning of the Reconstruction years, you actually could argue that, they did do that, right? Thaddeus Stevens, Charles Sumner, the radical Republicans were absolutely determined to pass these Reconstruction initiatives and give black rights. But as time went on, the Northerners just were losing interest. Remember, a big part of the reason why Republicans in the North supported Reconstruction so much, a lot of them were just idealistic. They really wanted to improve life for black Southerners, but some of it was cynical, right? A lot of Republicans knew that they needed black votes in order to continue to win elections in the South, right? So that was a big motivation behind a lot of radical Republicans insisting that black people have the right to vote, and Reconstruction cost an enormous amount of money, an enormous amount of time, right? The U.S. military, which, maybe had better things to do, fighting Indians out west or whatever, which we were doing at this time. But we had to divert all this manpower and resources into sending troops down south, reinforcing Reconstruction. And it just took too much money, too much time, involved too much manpower. Also, they're Northerners, but they're still kind of restricted by a lot of their own conservative ideas. This hardcore belief in property rights, right? That's a serious belief that most Americans have, North and South. So the idea of actually taking the land away from black people in the South, from the white people in the South and giving it to the blacks, was just from whites to blacks was just seen as, beyond the pale. Remember, Thaddeus Stevens proposed 40 acres and a mule, but Northern politicians, even at the height of Reconstruction, never seriously considered passing something like that. States' rights. I know that's the Southern mantra, states' rights all the time, but there are a lot of Northerners who also believe that. Doesn't Mississippi and Georgia and Tennessee have the right to run their own affairs, but the U.S. military basically telling them what to do? And also, and let's be frank, there was an enormous amount of racism in the North, right? So a lot of people in the North just did not think this was worth it. Or maybe it's not something we should even do at all, right? Insist on black rights and black voting and black citizenship and all of that. Now, how did history treat Reconstruction? Now, one thing I've told you a lot in class is that the current times, or the times the history is written, deeply impacts the way people interpret history. That's always the case. A book that's written in the 1930s generally interprets historical events differently than a book that'd be written today. And also everywhere in between. A book written in the 30s or the 50s or the 60s and 70s or the 90s, 2000s, whatever. The current times influence the way people interpret the history. And once Reconstruction was over, there really was no commitment anymore on the part of the North to black rights. It was kind of like, let them do whatever they want down there. We fought a civil war, and everything else. We had 12 years of Reconstruction. It's just not worth it. Let's just forget about it. And the North really wanted to move on. The South, though, did not move on. Could not move on, would not move on, whatever. Have to get a psychologist to kind of get that one. But the thing is, the South basically kept wanting to talk about Reconstruction and the Civil War. So just like the lost cause mythology, which we talked about before class ended, right? The idea that this Confederacy was right, that was a worthy cause, that it wasn't about slavery, all that. The lost cause mythology took hold during the post-Reconstruction years. But along with that, was the Southern interpretation of Reconstruction also took hold. And the Southern interpretation was basically that the whole Reconstruction experiment was an attempt by greedy Northerners, the carpetbaggers, or Northern politicians to take advantage of the South, which was in such a weakened position after having fought in the Civil War. Power was foisted upon the unprepared and or the uncivilized. People who should not be elected to office were being elected to office during Reconstruction. Of course, they meant blacks, right? Who they said were unfit for office. But also, they were talking about the carpetbaggers, right? That these Northerners were just basically coming in to take advantage of them. Then we have, of course, remember the scalawags were basically in a lot of Southerners' mind, just a bunch of white traitors, right? Basically white people who sided with the Reconstruction regime. A lot of the opponents of Reconstruction focused on what they thought was this unbelievable corruption that existed in the Southern governments. When I first started reading about history and I read like older books, that was the narrative, that Reconstruction was just greedy Northerners taking advantage of the South, and also a bunch of crooks who were just using their positions in these Reconstruction governments down south to enrich themselves. Remember, we talked about that, right? Corruption was endemic on every level of government in the 1870s. North, South, urban, rural, Democrat, Republican. Unfortunately, just corruption was kind of the name of the game. From the Grant administration to Tammany Hall, the Democratic machine in New York City. So, excuse me. Corruption was everywhere. So insofar as corruption existed in these Reconstruction governments, it was really no different than the corruption that existed elsewhere. Also, we should focus on the monumental achievements of Reconstruction. The 13th Amendment, which ended slavery. The 14th Amendment, which guaranteed equal rights. The 15th Amendment, which gave black men the right to vote. These are amazing achievements. Right? And also the fact that the Civil War ended in 1865, but by the end of the 1860s, we had black people voting, we had black people getting elected to office, we had black people in positions of authority and power in the South. That's an amazing social transformation in such a small amount of time. I can't really think not just in American history, but in history in general, where there was a social transformation quite that quickly. So that is remarkable. Another part of the Southern narrative about Reconstruction was a whole disparagement of the radical Republicans. Like, who are, these people? They were a bunch of fanatics, extremists, vindictive people who just basically want to take advantage of the South, or just hopelessly naive people. So it was all these, all this disparagement of the radical Republicans. And another thing, and now this might not be completely accepted by every historian, but I always believe this. One of the reasons I believe why President Grant had such a bad reputation, most people say it's because of all the corruption he tolerated in his administration. But I always believe, and I think the Grant book that we talked about a few videos ago, mentions this as well, that a lot of the reason why Grant got such a knock historically was because he was such a supporter of Reconstruction. So part of the Southern campaign to kind of take down Reconstruction involved taking down President Grant, because of this feeling that he was really the only one who was keeping Reconstruction going in the 1870s, which is kind of accurate. But I just don't. I think that's a big part of the reason why Grant's reputation, at least as president, has been so poor by historical standards. Even though, as we said, it's improving lately. The KKK. Was even portrayed in a positive light. If we had class, I'd show you clips of this, but there was an infamous movie in 1915 that came out called Birth of a Nation. Now, Birth of a Nation was a silent movie. It was basically it totally was a glorification of the Ku Klux Klan, saying that they were the ones who saved the South from Reconstruction and the ravages of blacks. It was an unbelievably racist movie, where they portrayed blacks in as horrendous a fashion as you can imagine, even though it's considered a very significant cinematic achievement today because it was a pretty good movie technologically for the times. But it's a hideously racist movie that glorified the Klan. Now, the Klan had been gone for 45 years when this movie came out, and after this movie, the Ku Klux Klan came back. Literally refounded that year. Focused this time still hating blacks, but now hating immigrants as well, particularly Jews and Catholics. So I can't believe that's a coincidence. Also, America was a very racist society, right? For most of the rest of the 19th and certainly a good deal of the 20th century. That's just a fact. So the racism of the times affected the way people felt about Reconstruction. Reconstruction was an attempt to give black people rights, and a lot of people in the late 19th, early to mid 20th century didn't think that was a worthy goal. So therefore did not look at Reconstruction fondly. But in the mid to late 20th century, with the emerging civil rights movement, Reconstruction began being seen in a more favorable light. Because again, remember, the times influence the way people interpret the history. So as we were undergoing the civil rights movement, a lot of people began saying, "Well, wait a minute, we did this before when we were trying to increase black rights. We did this during the Reconstruction years." So Reconstruction began getting seen more favorably since the civil rights movement, and a lot of people call. And I think this is accurate, call Reconstruction the unfinished revolution, right? We laid the groundwork for greater rights for African Americans, and we did a lot to make it happen, but it didn't work. It didn't work ultimately. But what is known for sure is that once Reconstruction was over, we left black Southerners completely to the devices and schemes and machinations of the white South, and that was not going to be good. All right, guys, so we'll stop now. In our next video, we'll talk about what Southerners did to their black citizens once Reconstruction was over. I emailed you your next assignment, so please do that. It's due on Friday, and I'll be posting another video soon about the aftermath of Reconstruction's of the ending of Reconstruction and what that meant for black Southerners. All right, see you next time. Peace.